Let's take a look at what an aperture is on a camera. We're going to talk about how to set the aperture, what the aperture does, and why you might want to use different apertures in different types of photography. So I've got here my Nikon D200 camera with a 50mm lens, and what I've done is I've set the aperture to 3.3. And this is the f-stop of 3.3. And if you want a little bit more information on what an f-stop is, you can look up online. Wikipedia has an awesome article on it. Basically what this means is I've set the aperture to be pretty big. This lens has a range of a maximum aperture of f1.8 and a minimum aperture of f16, which means it can open either really wide or really small. And the apertures vary on different cameras. If you've got a digital SLR like this, chances are it came with a kit lens. Maybe it said 18 to 55mm on it. Those lenses generally have an aperture range of about 3.5 to maybe 5.6, somewhere in there. What that means is when it's all the way zoomed out to 18mm and you can see a whole bunch of stuff in your camera, the maximum size of the opening is 3.5. Or on yours it might be a little different, but it's the maximum aperture size is the smallest number possible. When you've got your lens zoomed in all the way to the 55mm setting, the maximum aperture is going to be the other number, the 5.6. And this lens here doesn't zoom at all. It's a 50mm prime lens, which means there is no zoom. It's stuck at one setting. But what it does have is a really big maximum aperture. So let's take a look at this using this camera as an example. I've got the aperture set to 3.3, which is similar to the 3.6 aperture and a lot of kit lenses. And what you're going to see here is what a 3.3 aperture opening looks like. See how those blades come down to form that little hole in the center there? That opening is a 3.3 aperture. I'll do it again here. See that opening? That's a 3.3 aperture on this particular lens. Now I can open the aperture wider. Let's go to f2.4. That's a 2.4. And for comparison, here's the 3.3 again. Now what you'll notice is the 2.4 was quite a bit larger than the 3.3. It lets in a lot more light. This maximum aperture is 1.8, which means it can go clear up to this. You're probably not even going to see anything. You don't see anything at all. That's because it's a huge opening in there. And different lenses allow for different size openings. We can go a lot smaller though. Like right now it's set at f8. Really small opening in there. There you can see it, f8. This goes all the way down to f16. Barely see it there. So why would you want to use a really small aperture like that? That's hardly any light at all. Well, if you've got a situation where there's plenty of light, you don't really need to let a whole lot of light in order to take a good photo. If you go outside at high noon and the sun is shining, you don't need a huge old aperture to let in enough light to take your photo. But if it's a darker situation, if it's indoors or if it's in the evening, you might want to let more light in order to take your photo. So what you're going to find is that with a bigger aperture, like a f2.8, let's say, the lens lets in so much light that you don't really need the shutter to be open that long because it's getting so much light. So let's say it's in the evening. Maybe you've got a kid or a pet or something you want to take pictures of. Well, the problem is these things, these kids or pets, they move around a lot and it's hard to get them to freeze in one spot. So what you want to do is you want to have the shutter open just a tiny amount of time, like maybe a 60th or a 100th of a second or a 200th of a second. Because if your dog's running across the floor, you can't tell him to hold still while you take your photo. So what a lot of people do is they use a flash. And that flash, that burst of light, allows the camera to have a shutter that just opens and closes really quick and can sort of freeze the frame or freeze the action in the frame. Another thing you can do is get a lens with a big aperture. That aperture means that it's letting in so much light that you can have the shutter be open for just a tiny fraction of a second and it lets in enough light to take a good photo. Now you might have seen on a camera with a regular kit lens that some of the photos just are kind of blurry without the flash. That's because the biggest the aperture can go on those is about a 3.6 or about this big. And you compare that to the maximum aperture on a lens like this of 1.8, and there's just a lot more light coming into a lens like this. And that's not to say that a kit lens is bad, it's just different. It's just something to be aware of when you're using your camera. So how to set the aperture? Well, On some pocket cameras, you can't. Everything is just done automatically, and the software in the camera tries to determine the best aperture and shutter and ISO values for any given situation. But if your camera has manual controls, what you're going to do is put it in aperture priority mode. And what this means is you set the aperture and the camera does the rest. So you set how big you want the opening to be and how much light you want to come in. And the camera determines in general how fast to click the shutter and what ISO to use. Or you can set your camera to manual mode. And manual, you set everything. You set the aperture, the shutter value, and the ISO. And the camera doesn't really do much at all on its own. And finally, one other thing to know about aperture. A larger aperture means a shallower depth of field. And what that does is it allows you to focus on one tiny part of a scene. So you might have seen a portrait or a wildlife photography where there's just one thing in focus, like on an animal. It might be the face and the whiskers of a lion or a tiger, and the rest of it's kind of blurry. And if there's background trees, they're kind of blurry too. That's because it's got a shallow depth of field. A larger aperture makes this possible. If you don't have a very large aperture, you get a much longer depth of field, and that means more things are in focus. And again, it's not that one is better or worse. It's just something to be aware of as you're shooting your photos. So I hope that explains a little bit about aperture. If you have any questions, leave a comment, and I will do my best to respond. Thank you.